Hey everyone, welcome back to our channel. If you are wondering, is this virtual autism that I'm dealing with, or is this classic autism? This video is for you. I'm going to just be giving you some clues that I really felt were highlighted to me that said this is not a real autism diagnosis. I will preface it by saying I am not a medical expert. I'm not a doctor. I'm not an autism specialist. Really no one. All I am is a mother who had a daughter that was diagnosed with severe autism at 18 months old. And within 18 months of that diagnosis, she was fully recovered. So, Danny wasn't able to walk, talk. She had no eye contact. She had all the classic symptoms. But within 18 months, she was completely healed. If you haven't already watched her journey, there are two videos that I've done. I'll put the thumbnails here for you so you can see what they look like. I'll link them down below as well. I want to encourage you, go and watch those things. But as I said, today we're going to be talking about, is this virtual autism or is this classic autism? Let's get started. So the first thing you have to do is get real with yourself. Even if you don't tell anyone else the answer to this question, you have to be honest with yourself. Was my child overexposed to screens? Did he or she have 3 or more hours every day of screen time? In my situation, Danny was watching TV all the time. The TV was on constantly in the background. It was just on in the background. And it played a huge role. Obviously, I didn't realize that that was happening. I didn't realize that that was going to have such a big impact on her, but it did. And I have since come to know, having researched this, there are new studies coming up all the time. But if it's a television, if it's a phone, if it's a Nintendo, if they're watching over your shoulder, it's all considered screen time. So if your child had an excess of 3 hours or more every day, especially in that first 1 to 3 years while the brain is at a very critical developmental stage, there are high chances that this is a virtual autism symptom. As I said, I am not giving you advice and I'm not a medical expert. This is just what I saw. And what I'm telling you now is that I knew in my heart that Danny was overexposed to screens because of the fact that the TV was on all the time. And then as I started to study this new term that was coined in 2018 by a Romanian clinical psychologist, saying that there is such a thing as called virtual autism, that is autistic-like symptoms in young children that have been overexposed to screen times that don't actually have autism. It's symptoms that mimic autism. So that's the first thing I want to say to you. If you're wondering, is this real autism, classic autism, or is this virtual? Was your child overexposed to screens? And then on top of that, ask yourself, how much was I interacting, or how much parent-child interaction or person-child interaction was there? If the child was mostly on screens and mostly left on their own, that's a red flag for virtual autism. In other words, that should be encouraging to you, because then it's not classical autism. I've been studying into different things. There's a doctor, well, I don't know if you would call him a doctor. I think he would be called a doctor because he's an autism intervention specialist, and he talks about how there are very different diagnostic things that you'll see in autism and virtual autism. I'll touch on that in a second here, but let me just get through this here. So with Danny, I knew that there was an overexposure to screens. That was the first thing. I also knew that she had limited parent-child interaction because she was usually watching television instead of interacting with me. Danny watched, I would say, easily over 3 to 4 hours of television a day, some days more, just to put it out there. I also noticed that there was a regression with Danny, and I'm talking about very, very early on. When she was born, she didn't have a problem looking at me in the eyes. When she was born, I remember things like if the wind blew the door shut, she noticed it. She was aware of what was going on in the room. But those things faded as she got older. The more television she was exposed to, the older she got. There was a definite regression in things like eye contact, social interaction, even just being aware that there was anyone or anything else going on in the room. It reduced it got worse as she got older. The other thing that I want to point out is that Danny was checked for genetic metabolic, and neurodevelopmental conditions at the time of this diagnosis. In other words, they did a lot of testing and blood work on her, and there was no genetic reason for her to be found with autism, no neurological issues. So that points very heavily to environmental factors. In other words, environmental factors being screen time. So that was the other clue for me, was that there was no genetic reason, there was no neurological reason for the symptoms that I was seeing. I mentioned the expert in autism intervention. His name, I hope I'm saying this correctly, his name is Bahij Kuzami. Bahij Kuzami. He's an expert in autism interventions and culturally responsive practices. So he speaks of classic ASD, autism spectrum disorder, as being diagnosed in early childhood, and it's primarily caused by genetic and neurological factors, which make it a lifelong condition. It cannot be cured. You won't see an improvement. You might see some improvement in certain areas, but for the most part, it's a lifelong condition. It cannot be reversed. Virtual autism, caused by environmental factors, in other words, overexposure to screens. Something interesting, though, that he said is that he said that that can be diagnosed at whatever age there is an overuse of screens. He said he's seen 18-year-olds dealing with these things, and it's not linked only to very young. It hits the young ones very strongly because of that critical developmental time from 0 to 3 years old. But he says that it's been recognized now in any age where the child is actually having an overexposure to screens. And he also said that it presents with hyperactivity behaviors, stimming, repetitive behaviors and movements and stuff like that. He said that this is potentially reversible, where screen times is reduced and replaced with responsive social interaction and structured play. That's something that I go into in all those other videos that I've done. And I'm also creating a very, very in-depth document, basically breaking down exactly what I did, not only with, activities and therapies, but even things like diet and just structured around our daily life. All of that to say, this is when you dedicate time to your child, it is potentially reversible. And as I said, we saw that. We saw that in the life of Danny. So I just want to give you a synopsis of what this particular expert said. He said in classic autism, the onset is early childhood. The cause is genetic and neurological. He said the reversibility, not reversible. It's a lifelong condition. And he said the social motivation is often inherently reduced, regardless of therapy that you might do. But in virtual autism, he said that happens any age with screen overuse. The cause is environmental, in other words, screen time. Reversibility, it is potentially reversible with the right interactions, social interactions. And then he said social motivation, it may return with intervention with virtual autism. And as I said, that was the case with my daughter. So how do you figure out, what's actually affecting your child? You have to ask yourself some real questions. Was my child, overexposed to screens? Are there any genetic or neurological reasons that this could actually be autism, real autism, and not virtual? And then why don't you do a trial run? Remove screens and see, is there an improvement? That's what we did. That's how we discovered that things got dramatically better very, very quickly, in fact, when we cut the screens out. We made a number of changes. As I said, I'll go into quite a bit of detail in the other videos, and I will put it all in the document for you. But it cannot hurt doing a trial run. Make note of the things that you're seeing now. Is there eye contact? Do they point? Do they interact? Are they socially aware of what's going on? Make notes of all those things. And then just take the screen away for 30 days, or I would say do it for longer. Do it for 90 days. Within 3 months, you're going to know, is there an improvement, So as I said, I'm not a medical expert. I don't know much about much. All I can share is my story and what we did with my daughter. And that's what I'm passing on to you. I believe that, like us, if you remove the screens, you'll know very quickly within a few months, you'll know if there's an improvement in these areas that you're concerned about. But it does require tracking. You're going to have to track. And as I said, you can't just remove the screens. Removing the screens and then saying to your kid, okay, go outside and play, that's not good enough. You need a very strong parent-child interaction. As I said, I go into a lot of that, the things that I used to do for my child, and just how I made it nice and easy, interacting with my kid, making sure they were getting the interaction that they needed. And as I said, I'll be putting that in the document for you. If you haven't subscribed to the channel and you want a copy of that document, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell so that you get the notification when I release the video, because I will release a video saying, okay, that document is available. The document's going to be a very big document. It's going to list everything that I did, every step. I'm just trying to make it easy so that, you know, those parents that are desperate for help but don't have the finances for the therapy and haven't qualified yet, because I know getting a diagnosis can take months and months. In our case, it was a very long time. So I'm trying to make the therapies available, the things that we did. As I said, I'm not a medical expert, but it's the things that I did personally that actually helped my daughter recover. Hit the bell if you want to get that document. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it's helpful, and we'll see you next week. Bye.